me ask you something. You've got your broker authority. Maybe you've got your bond. You might even have a handful of carriers lined up, ready to run loads for you, but you're staring at your phone wondering, how do I actually find someone who will give me freight? That's the question that kills more new freight brokerages than anything else. Not regulations, not the market, just not knowing how to walk through the door. Okay? Here's a dirty secret that the industry doesn't advertise. Okay? Most new freight brokerages aren't failing because they don't know logistics. They're failing because they're trying to compete on price with brokers who've been in the industry for 20 plus years, right? Brokers with well-established relationships, volume discounts, and shipper contracts you can't touch yet. Okay? So what's your next move, right? You stop trying to be everything to everyone. You get surgical, pick a lane, literally and figuratively. And you've become the most valuable person in that specific corner of the market. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through how the exact framework for doing that. Okay. We're going to cover niche selection, lead sourcing, and a cold outreach approach that actually gets you calls back. Okay. By the end, you'll have a 30-day action plan that you can get started on today. All right. Let's get into it. So before we talk tactics, I need you to make one mental shift. Okay. Because this is the difference between the brokers who grind for 2 years and never break 6 figures and the ones who sign their first shipper in 30 days or 60 days. Okay. Stop thinking of yourself as a service provider. A service provider is a vendor. Okay. I'm kind of guilty of that because in some aspects, we are a service provider, but I hope this helps distinguish that a little bit. So vendors compete on price. All right. Vendors get replaced the moment someone undercuts them by 50 cents a mile. Okay. This is why in previous videos, I've said, try to avoid those shippers that have no problem quickly adding you to their freight distribution list. And they're already working with 20 or 30 other brokers. Right. Okay. So a strategic partner, that's the different relationship entirely. A strategic partner understands a shipper's specific problems, their seasonal urges, their capacity gaps, their compliance headaches, and they come to the table with solutions before the shipper even knew they needed them. Okay. Here's a simple test. If a transportation manager or a shipping company lost your number tomorrow, would they feel it? A vendor? Probably not. There are 100 other brokers, but a strategic partner, that's someone they'd go out of their way to find again. Okay. Your entire goal the first 90 days is to position yourself as that person for one specific type of shipper in one specific context. And that starts that starts choosing your niche. All right. The word niche sounds like a constraint. I want you to think of it as leverage. Okay. When you specialize, you compress your learning curve. You get better faster. You build a relationship faster and you win business that a generalist broker can't, right? Those ones that are just kind of throwing darts at a board hoping something sticks, right? They're ready to move drive-in freight, flatbed freight, anything they can get their hands on, okay? Because shippers trust experts over generalists every single time, okay? There are 3 main ways to niche down in freight brokerage. Let me walk you through each one, okay? The first one is equipment type, all right? The most common starting point is equipment specialization. Flatbeds, reefers, step decks, low boys for heavy haul. Each of these has its own carrier community, its own regulations, and its own shipper profiles, okay? For example, if you go deep on flatbed freight, you become fluent in tarping requirements, over dimensional permits, uh, things like loading securement requirements. That knowledge makes you immediately more valuable to any shipper moving things like steel coils, lumber, or any other like type of construction equipment, right? So number two is commodity. The second axis is the commodity itself. Okay. Something like temperature controlled produce, high value electronics, hazmat chemicals, industrial raw materials. All right. Produce is specifically interesting. It's a particularly interesting niche for new brokers. Okay. Because it's high volume, time sensitive, and the market moves fast. All right. That urgency works in your favor because shippers don't always have time to shop around. They need a solution now. And if you've built a reliable refrigerated carrier network, you're their solution. Okay. Now, the one thing I will add is that a lot of produce shippers have multiple brokers that they work with. So you're competing to secure that truck the quickest. Typically, this is not like bid freight. They already have a rate that they pay, right? So it's not normally a race to the bottom. It's a race to see who can secure capacity the quickest. Okay. The other thing I want to warn you about, again, I use this as an example, right? But when a lot of produce goes into places like Walmart, Myers, some of your big retail grocery chains and things, places like Walmart, for instance, and I'm just going to use them as one example, they will oftentimes over order because they want a constant supply of produce and they want the freshest produce. So what happens when their DCs, or if you're not familiar with that term, with what a DC is, it's a distribution center, is they'll start rejecting trucks when they have no more room. Well, then that puts you into a whole nother situation. You're calling your customer to let them know. Your driver's upset, right? Because he probably has his next load booked. He's counting on, being, in the dock, unloaded and out of there in 2 to 3 hours tops. Okay. So now this is a whole setback. You've got to reroute that load, take it to a different shipper or some sort of a refrigerated cross-dock facility. It presents a whole nother set of problems that you need to be aware of. Okay. And I'll kind of leave that at that. The third thing is geography. All right. The third axis is geographic lane specialization. Instead of being a broker who can move freight anywhere, right, you become an expert on a specific corridor. Maybe it's the Chicago to Atlanta lane. Maybe it's Midwest manufacturers shipping to Pacific ports. Okay. Why does this matter? Because when you own a lane, you start to understand its carrier density, its seasonal patterns, and its price rhythms better than anyone. Okay. You can offer shippers rates and capacity that out of area brokers can't match because they don't have the ground level intelligence, right? We just discussed that with those brokers that are generalists and they're just throwing darts at a board, hoping something sticks. I hope I get this customer. I hope I can secure a truck, right? Hope is, like I mentioned in my previous video, hope is not in our vocabulary. Okay. So now which axis should you choose from? All right. My recommendation, start with whatever overlaps with your existing background. Okay. Maybe your former military logistics. So you might want to start looking at like DOD related freight lanes. Okay. Maybe you worked in agricultural. So produce or the grain movement might be a good one for you. You lived in a manufacturing hub your whole life. Build your carrier network there first, right? Expertise you already have is a head start on the competition who doesn't. right? Maybe somebody who's worked at Burger King for the last 12 years or something, right? The next thing we're going to discuss is lead generation. All right. You've got your niche. Now we need to find people who ship that freight. Okay. This is where a whole lot of new brokers get lazy. They pull a random list and just start dialing. Sales is about the numbers, right? But it's also about quality over quantity, right? And that's real lead generation. That's when you start pulling a random list and just start dialing, that's guessing at scale. Okay. Real lead generations means identifying decision makers at companies that match your niche profile. Okay. Before you ever pick up the phone, let me show you 3 tools I'd use on day one. The first one, use directories like ThomasNet. Okay. ThomasNet.com is an industrial supplier directory. Think of it as Google, okay, specifically for manufacturers and industrial companies. You can search by product type, state, company size, okay, and it gives you your company names, locations, and oftentimes direct contact information. Not always, but oftentimes. If your niche is moving industrial raw materials out of the Southeast, you can go to ThomasNet, filter for manufacturers in states like Georgia or South Carolina, and you've got a list of potential shippers in under an hour for free, right? Tool number 2 is utilize LinkedIn or LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Okay. LinkedIn is where you find the person, not just the company. Okay. The person you're looking for has a title like transportation manager, logistics manager, supply chain director, or operations manager. Okay. Sales Navigator's free trial lets you search by job title, company size, and industry. You can identify 10 to 15 warm prospects per day during that period. See what they're posting about, walk into your outreach knowing exactly what they care about right now, right? The industry is always evolving. So the more you can kind of keep your pulse on your shippers' needs, what's going on in the industry, the better off you are. It's made me into a little bit of an insomniac. There's many times during the week I'm only sleeping maybe 3 hours, right? I love this industry, but I'm not saying you do it, right? But that's just me. So anyway, that's a pretty massive advantage over cold calling blind. Okay. I apologize. I've got a tickle on my nose there. So the next tool would be using DAT and freight databases. Okay. So the third source is logistics specific data. Okay. The DAT load board and similar platforms show you what freight is actually moving in your target lanes. This is intelligence you can bring directly into your outreach. Okay. And we'll show you how in this next segment. Okay. One more thing on lead generation I want to mention is don't try to build a list of 1,000 contacts, right? Build your list of 50 ideal targets and know everything you can about them. All right. Their shipping patterns, their pain points, their competition, quality over quantity, as I mentioned before, always wins in this game. Okay. And you can, if you're into AI, you can use AI to kind of help you along with that. If you're not comfortable with AI or you haven't started to implement that into your day-to-day, Google can still help you with that, right? Your normal search engine. So the cold outreach formula. Okay. This is the segment where most of you are here for. Okay. And what I want to start with, the thing that kills most outreach before it ever gets off the ground. The question, do you have any freight? is the worst opening line in freight brokerage, right? I've listened in, and as I've mentioned on previous videos, I've listened in on calls for, when I've done some coaching from new brokerages, new freight agents, and they literally call and they start selling to the gatekeeper, or even if they are able to reach the decision maker, they're just, can I be added to your freight distribution list? Do you have any freight going out this week? Things like that. It puts all the work on your prospect, the shipper, right? It signals you have no knowledge of their business. And it sounds exactly like, probably 100 other broker calls they got that week, right? So instead, your outreach formula has one job: demonstrate specific knowledge for their problem before they even ask who you are. Okay. Here's what a strong cold opening might sound like. All right. Now, this is an example, right? Practice this until it's natural, right? I've again, going back to previous videos, anytime you're doing cold outreach, by phone, practice maybe talking to your significant other, or practice in the mirror if you have to, right? Until it kind of rolls off the tongue, so it doesn't sound like you're reading from a script, right? So something, it might sound something like, "Hi, this is Joe from ABC Logistics. I specialize in dry van freight out of the Southeast region. I noticed you manufacture widgets in Atlanta. I work with a group of dedicated carriers, dry van carriers, who run backhauls out of that area and are actively looking for consistent outbound freight," right? "I want to find out if capacity has ever been a challenge for you and your team," right? Notice what that script does. It establishes your speciality immediately, right? That you're focusing on, manufacturers' needs that utilize dry vans. Okay. It shows you their geography and their product. It frames you as someone who has something to offer, not someone who's begging for a load, right? Like, "Do you have any freight going out this week?" You know, and it ends with a question that invites conversation instead of a yes or a no door slam, right? The most common objection that you'll probably hear is, "We're happy with our current broker." Okay. And here's how you handle that. Rather than just saying, "Okay, well, thanks for your time," and hanging up and moving on to the next call, you might want to just say something like, "That's great. Most shippers I talk to are," right? "I'm not looking to replace your current broker. I actually specialize in covering capacity gaps where primary providers are full and when you need a backup on short notice," right? That phone call at 4 o'clock. Okay. "Would it be useful to have a reliable alternative when your primary can't cover?" That reframe positions you as a compliment, not a competitor. Okay. It lowers the stakes of the conversation and opens the door to a backup carrier relationship that often turns into a primary one, right? You're just trying to get your foot in the door. Okay. Moving on to the email sequence. Okay. For email outreach, you're going to run a 3-part sequence, and here's the structure. Okay. Day one, the subject line might be something like "flatbed capacity for Atlanta outbound hyphen quick question." All right. You're going to want to send like one short paragraph demonstrating your specific knowledge of their lane or commodity. One question, nothing more. Okay. Email number 2, and you're going to send this out about day 3 or 4. And that subject line is going to read something like "flatbed capacity for Atlanta outbound." Provide something useful, a rate trend data point, right? Going back to DAT, and, or similar, and using, that forecast data or something. a regulatory update relevant to their freight type, or a capacity insight for their lane. No pitch, just value. Okay. Email number 3 is the soft close. You're gonna do that right around day 6, 7, 8. Okay. Subject line is going to read something like, last note on this. Be simple and direct. Acknowledge they're probably busy. Offer a 10-minute call to see if there's any fit. If not, no hard feelings, right? We're pretty thick-skinned, right? You have to be in this game. This email gets surprisingly high response rates because of its honesty, right? After those 3 touches, pause for 30 days and try again with a new angle. Persistence is a virtue in sales, okay? But you need to space it out. Nobody responds to the broker who emails them every hour or every day, right? They remember the one who was professional, respectful of their time, and showed up consistently over months, okay? So your 30-day action plan. Let me bring this all together for you in a 30-day roadmap. Here's exactly what I'd do if I was starting from ground zero today, right? Week 1 would be niche and research. Define your niche access, equipment, commodity, or lane. Build a list of 50 target shippers using ThomasNet and LinkedIn, right? That's a couple of examples. Identify the decision maker at each company. Research 10 companies deeply and understand their shipping patterns. Week 2 is build your carrier network, right? Source 15 to 20 carriers in your niche before you need them, which, before I get further into that, my next video is going to be part 2 on getting carriers to work with you as a new brokerage, because you have no credit score, no days to pay, right? And so you're going to end up getting passed over by a lot of, trucking capacity because of that one reason alone. And we're going to show you how to combat that in the next video. Okay. Vet them on things like the FMCSA. If you're using highway, RMIS, e-carrier check, right? I love e-carrier check. So if you don't already have e-carrier check, I would highly recommend that one. And I do have a link for them down below if you're curious and want to check them out. Confirm, you're going to want to confirm their insurance, their authority's active, if they've been caught with any double brokering, if they've hijacked any loads, held loads hostage, stolen, all of that kind of stuff that we need to kind of look at. Have some actual conversations, right? Understand their lanes and availability. This is your product. Know it before you sell it. Okay. Week 3, outreach launch. Launch your email sequence to all 50 targets, right? Begin phone outreach. Aim for 10 calls per day. All right. Used to be, and like I said, the industry is always evolving. It used to be, I remember when I first started, it was do your best to make 100+ calls per day, right? Just pick up and dial. It was all about the numbers, but as you kind of evolve and grow in this industry, you move away from being that generalist, right? And this is, I'm trying to help everybody kind of avoid that, scenario starting out, so that you are more successful quicker. Okay. Log everything into a simple CRM or a spreadsheet. Okay. And track who picked up, what they said, and the next follow-up date. Okay. Week 4 is follow-up and refinement. Send email 2 and email 3 to the sequence, right, that we discussed earlier. Schedule any calls that came from that week 3 outreach. Analyze which openers got responses, which industries responded, okay? And double down on what's working, cut what isn't, okay? So by day 30, you should have a minimum of 2 to 3 warm conversations in progress, people who know your name, know your niche or niche, and are at least opening to hearing from you again, right? That's your foundation. And in freight brokerage, foundations turn relationships, and relationships turn into leads. Okay. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. The brokers who win aren't the ones with the lowest rates or the biggest marketing budget, right? Don't run into this thinking that you're going to immediately compete against companies like CH Robinson, TQL, and the like, right? You're not. Okay. You're going to be the one who shows up with the most relevant knowledge for their most specific problems, right? Consistency over time. Okay. Pick your niche, learn it deeply, find 50 shippers who need exactly what you offer, and reach out with something specific and valuable every single time. Okay. If you found this helpful, drop a comment down below with your niche. I'd love to hear what you're focusing on. Okay. And again, we're going to do another deep dive, but on the other hurdle that you're going to face as a new brokerage, and that is securing that capacity. Okay. So again, this is part 1 of 2. And I hope everybody subscribes if you're new to the channel, and look for the next video. I hope to see you all here again.